and the caterpillar is what's responsible for the damage that we experience in Kansas each year. And this is a pest that we know has periodic outbreaks in the state of Kansas and the Midwest in general. Now, the last big outbreak was 2021, and this was a multi-state outbreak. Kansas was included. This outbreak was in the news. It was all over the place. It was a very, very big one. I would consider 2025 to also be an outbreak year. It might not have been multi-state, but Kansas definitely had some major issues and losses associated with this pest. So we're going to spend some time on fall armyworm first, and discuss some basics and why it seems to be some potential ideas for why it seems to be becoming more of an issue in Kansas over the last several years. All right, so first things first, sip of coffee here. So fall armyworm is a unique pest for Kansas in that it is a migratory insect. Fall armyworm does not overwinter in Kansas. It cannot survive our cold winters. It cannot survive our first freeze of the fall. And so each year it arrives from the Gulf Coast of Texas and Florida. You see down here this pink and blue along the Gulf Coast. It's active down there. And as the growing season starts in the south, basically the moths will kind of leapfrog on all the different crops all the way up into the Midwest and eventually make their way to Kansas and our neighboring states. And this can be a very challenging pest because the time of arrival into Kansas and the population size that initially arrives varies every year, and there's no real way to predict what we're going to get. So that's why we end up having some years are quiet, some years are outbreak years. So just quickly, a little bit about identification, because identifying pests is going to be very important in any case. You have to properly identify your insect pests before you make any kind of control decisions. And so when you're talking about fall armyworm, the caterpillar is going to be the most important stage to be able to identify. It's going to be the color can vary, but there's some characteristics that will always be constant. For one, if you look at it head on, it's going to have an inverted Y on the front of the face. And then along the side of its body, it's going to have a couple different stripes. And the thickest stripe is always going to be the darkest. So you see this blackish brownish stripe, it's the thickest one. This other stripe is thinner. So the thicker stripe is always darker. And that's important because there's similar species where the thicker stripe is the lighter one. So that's critical. And so with those features, you can identify caterpillars for fall armyworm. And one last thing is if you look at the top of the abdomen at the rear, you would see a series of 4 black spots where my arrow is right there. The adults are pretty drab, boring brown moths, as I like to call them. The female on the left, the male is on the right, has a little bit more color, but in general, just kind of boring brown moths. And I want to reiterate the importance of identification of all pests, including the fall armyworm, is because we get tied up in talking about worms, talking about caterpillars, talking about armyworm. You know, I've got armyworm out there, I've got cutworm, and there's actually a lot of different caterpillars potentially out in our crops in Kansas that we kind of can just lump into armyworm. And sometimes we're not really actually identifying what that particular armyworm really is. So for example, in Kansas, true armyworm, which is circled in red, the first one up here, and fall armyworm tend to be the caterpillars most responsible for damage in our commodities. And you'll see there's a variety of other armyworms that are possible in Kansas that are kind of secondary players. And this comes from a really great e-update article done by Dr. Jeff Whitworth, the entomologist, the extension entomologist on campus. So I encourage you to check out this e-update. He goes into great detail about these two species and the importance of identifying them. Because depending on what you have, especially late in the season, is going to determine what your control measures might be. Because fall armyworm cannot overwinter, true armyworm can. So your management decisions are going to be different. So getting out there and actually identifying the caterpillars, particularly late in the season, will go a long way. So that brings us to our first poll question here. So fall armyworm, can it overwinter in Kansas? True or false?
So, guys, we're doing polls just a little bit different today because we couldn't get them in for it to pop up. But we would ask everybody to just go over into the chat on the side of your screen and just answer in true or false. And so this is a little different than what we've been doing, but we couldn't get our polls up and running this morning, so we're gonna make it work with what we've got here. So if you just enter true or false in there, so Anthony's first question here is fall armyworm can overwinter in Kansas. True or false? We have a couple of answers in here so far, and we're split 50-50 on what we've got for answers. So if you guys want to just go over to the chat box and put it in, we've got folks behind the scenes watching to keep track of how things are coming in. Okay. So as we're watching here, Stacy, you want to give us the results?
Looks like it's one false and two true is what I'm seeing.
That's what I'm seeing also. Okay, so Anthony,
Yeah.
maybe
We'd like,
we need you to put us out of our misery here.
all
True
right.
or
So
false?
can fall armyworm overwinter in Kansas? So can it survive winter? Can it survive our freezing temperatures in the fall? That would be false. It cannot overwinter in Kansas.
It cannot. Okay, good to know.
And
Okay,
again, that's
so
going to impact management decisions late in the season, especially with these
okay,
extended warm falls.
excellent, which we seem to be having here lately.
Mhm.
So
All right,
okay,
ready to move on?
yes, we are.
All right. So we kind of talked about, fall armyworm, its origins, how it migrates up every season. It cannot overwinter, so it's a seasonal pest that is where it completely dependent on what arrives from the south. And there's a lot of things that can impact how they arrive to Kansas. The weather down south, weather patterns, control down south. How good of a job they're doing controlling fall armyworm south of us. That can impact the population that arrives. But right now we'll talk about historically, based on a publication that came out some years ago, when fall armyworm was generally accepted to begin arriving in Kansas. And so if you look at this map here, this study tracked fall armyworm populations migrating from the coast, the Gulf Coast, northward between 2011 and 2014. And in general, you can expect fall armyworm to arrive in Kansas mid to late June. And that's kind of been the accepted uh, timing of arrival for years and years and years. And as we've had continued problems with this pest over the last several seasons, particularly in eastern Kansas, it starts to make you wonder if something's changing with this pest. And it turns out that there could potentially be something going on here that we need to reevaluate when it comes to fall armyworm. So, excuse me. So, So why are we having increased issues? There's a lot of different potential reasons for this. Some of them speculation, some of them are data driven. Texas A&M was doing a lot of work on this for a while. I think they still are. But it looks like, at least over the last several years, and this was suspected before, so we've been doing a moth trapping network in Kansas for 3 years, going into the fourth year this coming season. And every season of this moth trapping network, in which fall armyworm is included, we've seen that fall armyworm is arriving in Kansas at least a month later than historically normal. So we're getting first catches in our traps mid to late July. So a full month later. And you might think, well, what's the big deal? A full month can mean a lot of difference depending on the pest. And so what's going on here? Um, so there's that change in arrival time. There's also in the last several years been record flights in Texas. So they're trapping in Texas for a dozen years or more, and they've been seeing larger flights of moths every season, and their pattern of arrival has changed as well. And there's some speculation as to why this is happening in regard to the increase in number, and that could be due to reduced Bt corn efficacy. So we know that Bt corn has a variety of Bt traits that are used to target caterpillar pests and corn ears. In some areas, those traits aren't working as well anymore. Some places they are working well, some places are failing. So in some areas where they're not working well, that could contribute to an increase in population of fall armyworm that's then moving north and making it to Kansas. There's also an increase in non-BT acres to the south of Kansas being planted, and those non-BT acres are going to be promoting populations of a variety of different caterpillar pests, including fall armyworm. So it could be that Kansas has a pump primed to have a larger population of moths arriving each season potentially for those reasons. And then when those moths arrive, the females are ready to lay eggs immediately. And so we're getting a larger population, a larger number of eggs being laid at a later time. And that makes us think about we need to be potentially reevaluating what is at risk and when. So historically, corn and sorghum were kind of, I would say, trap crops for fall armyworm. When they're arriving in mid-June, they would gravitate towards milo and corn in that whorl stage, and it really wouldn't be a big deal for those crops. It would make the plants look bad. Another name for fall armyworm is ragworm, because it would make those young whorl stage corn, whorl stage milo look really bad. And that would be about it. Of course, we could have headworm in milo later on, but that's a different story. Now that they're arriving later, it could be that corn and milo are no longer attractive hosts when they're making it to Kansas, and so they're gravitating towards different hosts. And fall armyworm has a huge host range, so they could be targeting other things. For example, pasture and brome and things like that in the eastern half of Kansas instead. But that's just something to think about. There hasn't been any actual data on that yet. So again, this is an example of a pest we might need to be reevaluating what is at risk and when. A lot of the pests we've been dealing with for a long time, the basics on our control recommendations and our understanding about its biology and life history are decades and decades old. And things are going to change over time, especially as our weather patterns change. And so this might be an example of that. And one of the goals of our moth trapping network is try to get on board with that to figure out what's changing and when and how, so we can figure out what's normal, quote unquote, for Kansas. And hopefully we could start dealing with this fall armyworm problem a little bit more efficiently. So there's some thoughts about that. So why fall armyworm has become more of an issue. And not to get too far in the weeds, but there are some other factors in the background that we can't control that could be contributing. So there are two different strains of fall armyworm, a corn strain and there's a rice strain. In the field, you cannot tell them apart visually. You just can't. It takes some lab testing and stuff like that to identify which strain they are. And like I said, fall armyworm has a huge host range of plants. The corn strain, they tend to prefer corn, sorghum, and cotton. Rice strain, generally hay, pastures, lawns. And so there could be mixed infestations any time of the year, and those mixed infestations will be targeting potentially different hosts in the landscape. So if you look at the map of the United States here, that shows you a general kind of where the different strains tend to occupy. The rice strain in blue, that's more of an eastern United States East Coast strain that dominates that area. When you get to the Midwest and Kansas, the corn strain dominates. And so that's what we should have. So that brings up a question, are the strains locations kind of intermingling more? Is there something changing on that front? We don't know. And as you go, another thing, as you go later into the season, from spring to fall, the ratio of those strains do change. So later in the season, you end up getting more rice strain popping up than or an increase in rice strain. So even in the Midwest. So as we're having fall armyworm arrive later, are we having more of an influx of rice strain, which prefers those pastures, hay, hay and lawns and things like that? Is that what's being contributing? That's just a thought. We can't say for sure yet. But that could be one of the factors driving the seemingly new issues we're having with this pest. So again, getting into the weeds there. And Texas A&M was working on this. I think they still are. but they're a good source to kind of dig into if you're interested in getting really in the weeds like this. And then again, weather patterns are definitely having an impact. They could be causing earlier mixing of strains in the Midwest than historically was normal. So there's a lot of stuff going on. And I guess all of that is to say, why is fall armyworm becoming more of an issue? We don't know, but here's all the potential reasons that are behind that. And again, the moth trapping network will help us kind of figure out what's normal over time. And now just some basics for fall armyworm. There's 2 to 3 generations a year in Kansas. And by generations, I mean, I guess you could simplify that to waves of caterpillars. So there's generally 2 distinct waves of caterpillars and a partial third, which usually gets fried by the first freeze. Okay. It could be that our weather patterns are changing enough that we're getting closer to having 3 generations, full generations, and that might be contributing to the increased damage as we get later into the season and early fall. But egg masses are really easy to identify the lamb on host plants. Vicinity of the host plants, they're in masses, and the female covers them with scales from her wings, so they look kind of moldy. And you can see there's significant foliar pests generally. So that's corn right there, for example. But in corn, in places where they're not controlled, some places that are introduced are a new pest and there's no BT corn, they can have significant impact on corn ear production. And then, of course, they're becoming more of an issue in pasture lawn and hay in Kansas. As you can see, there's a good example of how quickly some turf or lawn can be wiped out by a population at threshold. You have to realize as these caterpillars grow, the more they eat and the faster they eat. So, you could go out there in just a matter of days, you could have something like this happen if you let the caterpillars get too big. So when we're talking about late summer and early fall, as we have these continued warm falls, it only takes 1 to 2 fall armyworm caterpillars per square foot to destroy seedling alfalfa. As that alfalfa gets bigger, it can tolerate more worms, and if the alfalfa is happier, it can kind of keep up with that damage. But as we keep having these warmer falls and folks are planting earlier, this is definitely a pest you got to be on alert until that first freeze, because they'll keep on working until they get killed. Fields, pastures, and lawns, the threshold's really low, especially if conditions are warm enough to let those caterpillars grow quickly. They can consume a lot of material very quickly. So 3 or more worms per square foot would be threshold in those scenarios. So it doesn't take many. When you're talking about wheat, early planted wheat is going to be at risk. This past season, I was telling people you got to keep scouting until our first hard freeze. Don't just assume you're okay. So early planted wheat, as we have these warm falls, are going to be at risk from fall armyworm as they stick around longer. So we need to scout frequently after wheat emergence. And young caterpillars will start window painting, as you see here on the right. And any fields with 20-30% of plants showing window pane injury should be scouted daily. And as those caterpillars get bigger, you're going to be wanting to catch them before they're a ½ inch. They're easier to control when they're smaller. The larger they get, the less susceptible they are to a lot of products. And again, the more they eat, faster. And so they can really get ahead of you a lot quicker than you think. And again, when we're talking about sorghum and corn, historically, that's what they gravitate towards in the whorl stage. They make the plants look ugly, but it takes a lot of damage and active worms to really trigger treatment. And even if you need to treat, it's tricky because they're protected. They like to hang out in that whorl, and they'll plug that whorl with a bunch of their frass, their poop, and make it hard for that product to get to them. So it's really tricky to even try to control them. When you get into sorghum heading at reproduction, of course, you can have fall armyworm as one of the headworms, and you can lose some yield from them in that manner. Fortunately, there are a lot of products out there that will control fall armyworm really well. This is an example. I forget, it might be from the wheat insect management guide, but if you access all our management guides online, they'll have tables for each pest and products registered for Kansas that are usable for each pest with the recommended rates. Of course, double check the labels before you do anything. So there's plenty of management options. But again, scouting early and often is critical to achieving proper control no matter what is used, especially with this pest, especially as we get later into the season and also earlier in the season when they first start arriving into Kansas, which our traps are out to let y'all know when they start arriving, so you can start scouting for young caterpillars during the season. All right, so that's fall armyworm. I wanted to start out with again, like I said, because it was such a big issue last year, or yeah, last season, and a few years ago, and it seems to be more of an issue in eastern Kansas going forward. We'll see if that persists, but I think that should definitely be on folks' radar going into this season as well. I want to talk about grasshoppers a bit, just seeing based on what I saw at the end of last season in regard to population. Grasshoppers are always kind of a threat every season. We never know really what they're going to do. Weather does really impact what their populations do. But I want to point out that only a handful of grasshoppers have the potential to be those major agronomic pest grasshoppers, the ones that can reproduce extremely quickly and aggregate and wipe out a lot of commodity fast. And those are the ones you see on the screen here. I don't expect you to memorize them. Um, a grasshopper is a grasshopper is a grasshopper, in my opinion, when it comes to control and agronomic settings. All the products listed for grasshopper will work on all these species you see here just the same. But I point this out that there's only a handful because there are over 100 species of grasshoppers in Kansas. It's a prairie state. It makes sense. Grasshoppers are a prairie grassland type insect, so we have a large diversity, but only a very few, no, a very small number of grasshoppers can actually be an issue. And I get asked a lot, why are grasshoppers always around? Well, like I said, there's just hundreds, 100+ species, so they're always going to be around in some fashion. And with all those species, of course, they don't all just emerge at the same time each season. They don't all have the same developmental rate, things like that. So they have overlap in their life cycles. So some species, their egg hatch varies. So you can have some egg masses hatch in as little as, fully in 2 weeks in the season. And some species take 2 months to finish hatching. So you have a trickle of grasshoppers into the environment. And then some species develop very slowly and into adults, and some species very quickly, relatively speaking. So at any given time during the year, you're gonna have a mixture of adult grasshoppers, nymph grasshoppers. There are gonna be grasshoppers all over. But it's just certain scenarios where we got to keep an eye out, early planted wheat and alfalfa in the fall. Um, if you're out in your field and you're seeing elevated grasshopper activity and feeding in corn and milo and things like that during the summer, stop, take a closer look and see what's going on. And then you have species that will emerge really early in the season, like the two-striped grasshopper. That's probably the first grasshopper you're going to see during the season. And then you have some that are going to be emerging much later in the year, like the red-legged, and that thing will be emerging for up to 2 months. And so these are grasshoppers, the differential and the red-legged that you can see going all the way up into the first killing freeze. And I saw a lot of differential grasshoppers towards the end of last season up until the first freeze. So they were very abundant last season. And so the second question I get is, oh, we're in a drought year. We're in a series of, drought years or dry years. I'm worried about grasshoppers. So why do grasshoppers and drought seem to go hand in hand? Well, weather is very important for grasshopper population dynamics in a couple of ways. When you're talking about the grasshopper itself, when we have warm, drier spring weather, those eggs that were laid last fall so that spring, warm spring weather, those eggs are going to hatch better, and more nymphs are going to survive to adulthood when we have a warm, dry spring, relatively dry, as opposed to a wet, cool spring, which promotes a lot of fungus that attacks egg cases and nymphs. And so with a cool, wet spring, that's going to knock back nymph population and egg masses, and that's going to slow down population growth for the spring. So that would be to our advantage, a cool, wet spring. And then we have these warm, prolonged falls due to maybe drought patterns. That's going to allow longer adult activity, which means potentially more egg laying in the landscape later into the season. So we're priming the landscape into the fall later than it usually would be So there's more eggs that could potentially hatch the next season. And so when we have multiple years like this, we're building up our grasshopper population slowly until we end up with an outbreak. So it's not just 1 year of drought that'll be an issue. It's multiple years with this kind of pattern that could be important. But weather isn't just important for grasshopper population, it's also important for alternate host plant populations, which can bolster indirectly grasshopper populations. So when we have these periods of sudden warm spells in the spring and some unexpected wet weather that kind of makes all of our weeds in the ditches boom and weeds in the fields go crazy. Those other weeds, those forbs like pigweed, all that stuff, kochia, all those broadleaf weeds actually are more preferred by grasshoppers. And in lab studies, they show that grasshopper diets based on those type of forbs, they have higher nymph survival, faster growth rates, they become larger adults, and females lay more eggs. So when we have these dry spells and then these periodic outbreaks of wet weather that promote a lot of weeds that don't get managed quickly, we can end up having one season where we have 3 square yard grasshoppers per square yard, and the next season 30 per square yard, which can lead to a major outbreak. So weather is really important in a lot of different ways for grasshoppers. It's not just the fact that, oh, we're in a drought, now we're going to have an outbreak. That's not necessarily the case. So it's a little bit more nuanced, and I like to point that out to folks. So going into this season, personal observations, like I said, the end of 2025, there were very high numbers of grasshoppers late into the season. I saw them into October, and a lot of them were that differential grasshopper, which is one of the outbreak species. And so what our spring weather does this season will be really important to see how our population begins. And then we just need to have this on our radar as we get into the season. What we see on the right here is a grasshopper hazard map from the USDA APHIS. Kansas used to be involved in this, but they cut funding. But what we see, the darker areas here, the orange, the red up here near the northwest corner of Kansas, that's elevated risk for grasshopper activity. So I would say Western Kansas going into 2026, and this is based on surveys they did last summer on grasshopper populations. I think we would have elevated potential risks for grasshopper issues this year. So that's something just everyone needs to keep on the radar going into this growing season. And just to give you an idea of thresholds for grasshoppers when you're dealing with like, seedling wheat, seedling alfalfa, just 3 or more per square yard can wipe out a whole field. So we really need to be vigilant about this season. It doesn't take many when we're dealing with younger crops. And that leads us to our second poll question. Would you like me to read this first, or do you want to, Jeannie?
Okay, so we're at question number 2. So you'll answer over in your chat box or in the comment section on YouTube. Grasshopper eggs hatch better during your choices are A, a cool, wet spring, B, a warm, dry spring, or C, weather does not matter. So again, our options are when grasshopper egg hatches better is during a cool, wet spring, during a warm, dry spring, or weather does not matter. We'll give you guys just a couple more seconds to go ahead and get your answers put in. Okay, Aaron, do you have any answers on YouTube? And Lacey, do you want to give us the answers for here on Zoom?
Looks like we have 3 Bs and 1 A.
Okay, Aaron, do you have anything?
Nope, no answers on YouTube.
Okay. All right. So,
Oh, there it is.
Anthony,
B.
B. Okay. So we have several answers that are B. Is that correct?
That would be correct. So grasshopper eggs will hatch better during a warm, dry spring. So B is correct because during a cooler, wetter spring, fungal pathogens of different sorts attack eggs and nymphs. So warm, dry spring it is.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yep. All right, the next pest I want to bring up, which is known to be a periodic outbreak species, particularly in western Kansas, I wanted to talk about because I'm getting calls about this pest active in western Kansas right now. The last time there was a major outbreak of brown wheat mite was, I believe, 2022, and that extended all the way into central Kansas. So this is primarily a western Kansas pest, but on bad years it can extend eastward. But the brown wheat mite, it's a real creative name. It's a tiny brown mite that attacks wheat. So that's a pretty simple one, common name. It also attacks triticale. And this is just an example of the mite itself magnified on the left, and then, oh, I lost my mouse. That's okay. And then on the right, kind of a search image. That's what they'll look like in a wheat field when you got an infestation. Just brown spots, and they move very rapidly throughout the field. They're very quick and mobile mites. And so brown wheat mite favors dry land and continuous wheat and triticale. Um, that just builds their populations over time. And when they get the particular weather they like, populations can really skyrocket quickly. And they like cool, dry weather. So this is one of the species that benefit from drier than normal years. And so areas that are staying dry going into spring should be on the lookout for this, especially since I'm already getting reports in western Kansas. But eggs hatch in the fall, and they'll be active in wheat fields and triticale fields in the fall, but they're not really an issue. They go dormant, and then they're the major risk is early spring. So right now, my activity will start about now, March, and it'll peak towards the end of April. And usually it's wrapped up by mid-May. So it's a very short period of time, but that short period of time, populations can get to outbreaks so bad that it can wipe out fields. So this is one that folks have to stay on top of. This mite is active during the day on all leaf surfaces. They do not make webbing, so it's not like spider mites. They're very mobile. They move around. They don't just sit on leaves. They don't make webbing. And the outbreak potential is so high because all mites are female. They don't have males. They don't need to sexually reproduce. And each female can lay 90 plus eggs in a little less than a month. And those eggs hatch. That's another female. She can lay her eggs. And so under the right weather conditions, populations can increase exponentially, and you can end up with massive population very quickly if you're not paying attention to what's going on in that field. And sometimes this pest is easily missed because its damage really, especially early on, mimics drought stress. And so these mites are feeding on individual cells in on the leaves of the wheat or triticale. And so on the right picture, you see the stippling, the little yellow spots. That's caused by mite feeding. And those yellow spots slowly expand to cause leaf death. But they usually start from the tip down on the leaf. So you got leaf scorching from the tip down. And a lot of the times folks will think, oh, that's a drought stress field, especially if we're in a dry period of time. And so if you see what looks like a drought stress field right now, get out there, see if you can find some wheat mites. If they're out there in notable numbers, they're easy to find, even though they're small. You'll see them on your boots, on leaves, things like that. But luckily, there's plenty of things for control, a lot of them for suppression, the last four, which can be useful if you don't have access to a dimethoate, which offers complete control. Just understand that all these products kill beneficials, and we want to remember that weed is really important for producing those beneficials that help us the rest of the year. Thresholds aren't well defined. It's really several hundred per foot of row. Oh, and chlorpyrifos is again usable, so that's another product available that offers complete control. But if you have a field that looks like it's declining and you got a lot of mites, you're probably going to have to make a treatment decision. And that decision can be impacted by several things. So if you have a soaking rain in the forecast, believe it or not, a good hard rain will just basically drown out that population and wipe it out, and you won't have to worry about them. Now, it's still early in the cycle for this pest. You're going to want to start scouting for egg masses. And that sounds crazy, but it can be done. You need a hand lens. Basically get out into that field and pick up clods of dirt, look on the bottom, or old corn stubble, look on the bottom. And if you see a bunch of little white eggs, like you see on the right on that bottom little inset, those eggs are overwintering eggs. So if you see a bunch of those, that population is in decline, and you do not need to treat because it's naturally crashing. If you see a bunch of reddish bronze eggs, those eggs are hatching right now, and that population is increasing. So you'll probably want to treat. Those white eggs aren't going to hatch until the fall, so they're not going to be a problem. So that's something you need to take into consideration with this particular pest as well. So keep that on your radar going into this season, especially since I'm getting reports. There is an e-update hopefully coming out soon in regard to brown wheat mite that I did. So keep your eye out on that.
Anthony, can I ask you a quick question about brown wheat mites?
Yes.
Okay, so I often get this question about them being primarily around the edges of fields versus being further out into a field and just doing some treatment around the edge of a field. Is that a good management strategy for these guys?
That can happen. I would say that's the importance of having boots on the ground and being out there and seeing what you're seeing. If it's really restricted to the outer edges and you walk into that field a good ways and you don't see any hot spots, that could be a way to start. But if you have some spots in the middle of that field, again, those populations can grow really quickly and you could have a problem on your hand in a week or two later and you might have to spray again. So I would just encourage folks to get out in that field, go all the way into the field and see what's going on in the middle as well.
Good deal. Thank you.
Uh-huh. All right, let's see what I got. Okay, think I'm good on time. Western bean cutworm, I want to touch on that because that is an issue for northwestern Kansas. It's another boring brown moth, as you see here. Um, the caterpillars are easy to identify. They have those two dark stripes on the back behind their eyes there on their head. The colors will vary, but that's how you identify them. Usually they'll be in the corn ear, so you won't notice them until you rip open an ear of corn. But that's the kind of damage they can do, and they can be pretty significant. As you can see, there could be multiple caterpillars per ear, as opposed to corn earworm, which usually just has one per ear. And they could co-infest with corn earworm. So if you have western bean cutworm issues, you already have an issue. And if you have corn earworm cohabiting with them, it could lead to even more yield loss. So this is definitely a pest to start having on your radar, and this is one that we're trapping for with our network to keep people informed as to when they're emerging in Kansas. They do overwinter, and they will emerge from the soil in Kansas, and there's just one generation, luckily, that'll impact corn. And if you can get ahead of it by scouting, you'll be okay. But the story behind this pest is kind of interesting. I'll just highlight it really quickly. For decades and decades and decades, all the way back to like the 30s and 40s, this was just a pest of dry bean production in the desert Southwest. And suddenly it rapidly expanded its range north and east into even New England area. And that was about early 2000s. And this was very unexpected. It never was a corn pest. It became one very, very fast. And they determined that it was because of the advent of BT corn. So BT corn was released around the same time, was controlling for corn earworm primarily, and was controlling corn earworm perfectly. We had millions of acres of squeaky clean corn. Western bean cutworm found that it could use corn as a host and just jumped right into that vacuum. And now we have a new corn pest since then. Luckily, we have some BT toxins that target Western bean cutworm now, so it's not as big as an issue. But back then, those toxins weren't meant to target Western bean cutworm, and it was causing a lot of problems. So that's just kind of a little background story for you there. I won't say that scouting for this pest is the funnest, but at least it's just a short window of time, basically a 2-month period where you got to be on your toes. You're going to want to start scouting fields when silks begin to emerge, and you're going to be looking for egg masses. And those egg masses will start out white, and they'll turn purple right before they hatch. And if you're scouting and you have 5 to 8% of plants with eggs or small larvae present, when the field is mostly tasseled, you're going to want to treat that field, and you want to do it quickly because these caterpillars, once they get inside the ears that are developing, they're protected by sprays. And so this is one that you got to scout for weekly. And when you need to treat, it has to be very timely if you want to get ahead of them. Again, there's the BT traits that are working to control them, but there still are some yield losses occurring in western Kansas from this pest, despite BT being out there. All right. Luckily, corn leafhopper wasn't as big as an issue last season that we thought it might be. We're going into this season. We don't know what's going to happen with it, so this is just a quick reminder about corn leafhopper. Tiny little leafhopper that prefers corn. It's got a splinter-like body. It's tannish yellow color. And the big thing, and we'll cover identification again in a minute, is the two dark spots between its eyes. That's a big giveaway right there, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But this was a very unexpected pest to show up in Kansas when it did the other year. And leafhoppers as pests, agronomic pests, is nothing new. Potato leafhopper is an example, beet leafhopper. So nothing new at all. They're out there in North America. This is just happened to be a new one for corn for the first time in the United States. And all leafhoppers share a similar life cycle. They go from eggs, they hatch, and they go through several developed younger stages that look like adults without wings, and then they form adults. The eggs are laid in the leaf material of the host plant, so they're protected by sprays. And all the stages cause the same kind of damage. And so when scouting for these, you lump the immatures and the matures because they're all doing the same kind of damage. And what kind of damage are they doing? They have piercing, sucking mouth parts, so they're going to be piercing individual cells, destroying those cells, stopping photosynthesis, breaking down that tissue, causing necrotic lesions, and something called hopper burn, right? So those leaves are going to take on that appearance you see on the right. And then on the very bottom left, that's just an enhanced photo of what the piercing, sucking mouth parts of true bugs look like. That's not a leafhopper. That's a very large true bug. That is easy to see the mouth parts. But that's basically what you're dealing with when you're talking about leafhopper mouth parts. So that's some primary simple damage. They also cause some indirect damage through their honeydew, which is their waste. Their waste comes out as a very sugary liquid that causes sooty mold and prevents photosynthesis when it gets really thick. And that's kind of a secondary issue. And a lot of other insects are attracted to honeydew. So that's kind of a scouting tip. If you're in a field and you see a lot of insect activity in one little isolated spot, especially if you're scouting for something like sorghum aphid, you might go to that spot and see you might have sorghum aphids there because they excrete honeydew as well, for example. But the most significant risk for leafhopper is disease transmission. And I know in the last crop talk they hit on this a lot, so I'll kind of skim over it. But when they feed, if that leafhopper happens to be carrying these pathogens that are causing corn stunt, they're going to transmit that to the plant and they're going to infect that plant. So the biggest risk from leafhopper is going to be that disease transmission aspect when it comes to corn production. And that leads us to our third question here.
Okay, question number 3. So the biggest risk posed by the corn leafhopper is, your choices are A, B, or C. A, hopper burn, B, sooty mildew, or C, disease transmission. So if you'll put your answers into the chat box on Zoom or on the comment box on YouTube, we would sure appreciate that. So the biggest risk posed by the corn leafhopper is hopper burn, sooty mildew, or disease transmission. So thanks, Anthony, for talking through corn leafhoppers. They're not something that we've, paid much attention to until the last couple of years. And so it's kind of caught our attention, even though we've had lots of leafhoppers around for us to see. We've not had big discussions about them necessarily before now. So, okay, we've got a couple of answers that have came in here. We'll give you guys just a couple more seconds to put any more answers in. So, okay, it looks like what I can see on Zoom. Okay, we have got, okay, it looks like Ant C looks to be the answer that most everyone is going with. Anthony, how does that sound?
That is correct. Disease transmission.
Good deal. Okay. I'm sorry, Aaron, you just unmuted. Did you have somebody else? Okay, we'll just keep rolling. Go ahead, Anthony.
All right. I know we're down to 10 minutes here, so I have a couple other slides I might skip by. There's one particular pest I really want to highlight before we get out of here. But this is just kind of overall showing you that corn leaf hopper are very skittish. They can be kind of hard to scout for. They blend in really well, as you can see there, just to give you a visual. And as talked about in the last crop talk, the most confused other leafhopper is the aster leafhopper, but you can see down there on the bottom right, aster leafhopper has way more markings on its face. So keep that in mind. And as far as control recommendations, they talked about that. Um, Planting as early as possible is really going to be our friend when it comes to this pest in Kansas at the moment. There are some things they do down south, which right now aren't tried and tested in Kansas yet, which if this becomes a major issue, we would definitely be looking more into these kind of things for Kansas. But I wanted to wrap up real quick with wheat stem sawfly because this is an emerging pest. It's been kind of emerging for several years in northwest Kansas, and luckily it hasn't gone too crazy, or it hasn't gone crazy yet. But that's the wheat stem sawfly. And so this can be a very significant pest. Native wasp that jumped to wheat some years ago in our neighboring northern states that can cause very significant damage in wheat. Basically, the adult wasps lay eggs in the stems of the wheat, and those young grub wasp larvae basically consume their way down that stem to the base of the stem, and they girdle it and they plug up their little overwintering chamber for the season to emerge next year as adults. And what they do is cause massive lodging, like you see on the right there. So if you experience any suspect lodging of wheat fields in northwest Kansas, even north central, just anywhere, please reach out to myself or Jeannie, Lucas, your local extension agents, and let them know, because this is something we're trying to stay on top of. Jeannie and Lucas have been doing a lot of work on this before I was even here. So this is something we definitely don't want to see get out of control in Kansas. But I wanted to make sure everyone was aware of this. This is on our radar. We are paying attention to it to make sure that producers are well informed. And when it comes to control options for this, what we're seeing is variety selection is going to be our best gambit for dealing with this pest if it becomes a major issue in Kansas. There are other cultural control options that are going to be minimally effective, like tillage and fire. If you have a severe infestation, it only takes 15% of that population to survive to be a problem next year. So increasing distance between infested fields and new planted fields can help. Even though the adults are wasps, they don't have a huge range of mobility. They kind of stay put. Planting data is something that Nebraska's playing with, I understand, but variety selection is going to be our big friend here. Chemical control is not recommended. And I think, Jeannie, you could remind me if I'm wrong, but someone's quoted as saying, you'll run out of money trying to spray sawfly before you run out of sawfly.
That is
Again,
exactly right.
there you go. So don't even think about that. So again, we're staying on top of that to keep folks informed about this potentially devastating pest. So with that, I'll leave it there. Since we're short on time, I'd like to make sure everyone can ask questions if they have them. So thank you very much for your time, everybody.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. I appreciate the fact that we ended on wheat stem sawfly. So yes, this is something that we're very much keeping an eye on. Thank you, Anthony, for going over all of the insect pests today. So if you guys have questions, please put them in the Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen or on the uh, uh, comment section in YouTube, and we'll take any questions that you guys have as we move forward here. I would just add a little bit on wheat stem sawfly that we have been doing sampling over here on the Kansas side of the Kansas-Colorado state line and the Kansas and Nebraska state line. So we have been doing some additional sampling, trying to gauge what all is carrying on. We have picked up some suspect areas this last year right on the state line, and so we're actually currently splitting wheat stems and looking for larvae inside of them. And we have been cautiously watching for this for the last couple of years, and then really kind of I got a call on it this year and went and did some looking at stuff. So any other questions for Anthony on any insect pests that you are seeing out in the field? I know I jumped in real quick on brown wheat mites. Anthony, on the brown wheat mite pressure, what growth stage does our wheat get to? And then we kind of transition out of not being near as worried about seeing brown wheat mites.
Uh, so and I'll have to apologize. Just so you know, I can't stop screen sharing because of a battery in my mouse died. So I'm
Oh,
sorry.
okay, okay. I will stop your screen sharing
Okay,
then.
great. Okay, sorry about that.
No
I would
problem.
say more of it's a matter of tracking the mite, where the mite is in its seasonality. Like I said, March through mid-May is when it would be a concern. I'd say once you start getting towards the end of April, the concern for the population, once it starts getting warmer, these mites don't like it warm and they're going to be naturally declining. So I think it's more of if you have them out there, you need to be paying attention to their population dynamics. If you have a weak stand or a stand that got started later or it's unhappy for some reason, that's going to be more at risk than maybe a really lush, thick stand that was planted early, did really well, and it's real happy. It could tolerate a lot more mites probably and be okay. So I would say it's a matter of stand vigor, but paying attention to the mites themselves and checking out their eggs, what they're laying. Because again, once you get to those white eggs, when that's all you're seeing, that population's about to crash, and you really should kind of hold off and not waste any money.
Good deal. Anybody else have questions that have came in anybody's boxes here? Okay, not hearing any questions. Thank you, Anthony.
Mhm.
Stacy, I think we're ready to switch over to you.
Yeah, if there's no questions, and if you do think of a question, go ahead and you could put that in the chat box of the Q&A. But we do very much appreciate you sticking with us and attending the last Crop Talk today. And once again, if you're a CCA, if you need CCA credits, you need to email Jeannie Falk Jones now as well, so she can record you as attending and get those credits. And also, like Jessica said, she said we can't do better if we don't know better. So please go ahead and fill out the quick little survey or evaluation of the program today. If you would please, that would help us out. Only to take a minute here. And I think that's it. We appreciate it. Oh, also, if it's in the chat box, if you need to go look at the slides later, you can do that. Also, if you missed any of the prior presentations, those are also recorded and on that same location website where the slides are at. If you want to go back and see any of the other Crop Talk presentations if you happen to miss them, or if you even want to review them again and share them with your neighbors and friends too if they weren't able to make it and start asking you questions about it and were wondering about it. So with that, we really thank you for attending today's Crop Talk webinar and the others if you have, and please fill out the quick little survey and we'll look forward to having this again next year.
All right, thank you. I can't scroll. What's the breakdown on the second number 2 crop poll?
Same.
Yeah, same.
Oh, same. Okay.
Yeah, I can't see it either.
Okay, guys, we're going to join over on, should have got a Zoom link to join on the debrief coming up here in just as soon as we switch services here.